An economic and diplomatic standoff has intensified between Ottawa and Washington following a series of public ultimatums issued by the United States regarding the future of North American trade. At the center of the dispute is the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement, or CUSMA, which currently facilitates nearly $2 trillion in annual bilateral trade. As the mandatory review clause for the agreement approaches in July 2026, U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer has delivered 5 non-negotiable demands to Congress that Canada must satisfy to secure a 16-year extension. These conditions target foundational sectors of the Canadian economy and sovereignty, including dairy supply management, digital media regulations, provincial alcohol restrictions, government procurement practices, and energy grid management. The scale of the trade relationship underscores the gravity of the current friction. Data from the U.S. Energy Information Administration confirms that 3.8 million barrels of Canadian crude oil flow into American refineries every day, representing approximately 23% of the total feedstock for the U.S. refining industry. This structural dependency is particularly acute on the Gulf Coast, where multi-billion-dollar infrastructure is specifically engineered to process Canadian heavy sour crude. Despite this deep integration, the public nature of Washington's demands has signaled a shift from traditional back-channel diplomacy to high-stakes political theater, forcing an immediate and definitive response from the Canadian government. Mark Carney, reviewing the ultimatum, rejected all 5 demands within 24 hours. The rejection was not conducted through private diplomatic notes, but was issued publicly and without hesitation, setting the stage for what analysts are calling a political earthquake. Carney's stance emphasizes that the targeted policies, ranging from cultural protections in digital media to the legal framework of the dairy industry, are not up for negotiation. This defiance has shifted the focus of the debate from the demands themselves to the underlying question of leverage, whether the United States can afford to disrupt a trade architecture that its own industrial base relies upon, or if Canada's prepared refusals have exposed a strategic miscalculation in Washington's approach. The core of the current dispute rests on 5 specific pillars that Washington has identified as barriers to a trade extension. The first demand concerns Canada's dairy supply management system, which U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer labeled fundamentally unfair due to tariffs that can exceed 298% for out-of-quota imports. This system, which regulates production and pricing to stabilize the domestic market, has become a focal point for American agricultural producers in states like Wisconsin and Minnesota. However, Canadian officials have pointed to a significant legal hurdle. Weeks prior to the U.S. ultimatum, Canada passed legislation that enshrines these dairy protections into law. This legislative barrier means that any concession would require the repeal of a federal statute, a process that is unlikely to be completed before the July 2026 deadline. The second and third demands target Canadian digital media and alcohol regulations. Washington has classified the Online Streaming Act and the Online News Act as discriminatory toward U.S. technology firms such as Netflix, Google, and Meta, as these laws require platforms to fund domestic content and compensate Canadian publishers. Simultaneously, the U.S. is demanding the removal of provincial bans on American beer and wine in Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia. These bans were originally implemented as direct retaliation for U.S. Section 232 tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum. In his public refusal, Mark Carney maintained that these measures are non-negotiable, specifically noting that the alcohol bans are a consequence of U.S. trade actions and will not be lifted until the underlying tariffs are removed. Beyond these sectors, the U.S. ultimatum includes demands regarding government procurement and energy policy. Greer accused several Canadian provinces of favoring domestic suppliers in public contracts, calling the practice a barrier to fair competition. This accusation has been met with significant pushback, as Canadian negotiators have cited the long-standing Buy American provisions and the 2021 Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act as evidence that the United States maintains similar, if not more stringent, domestic procurement requirements at the federal level. Additionally, allegations of preferential treatment in Alberta's electricity grid management were rejected outright by provincial utilities ministers, who cited operational data showing no exclusion of U.S. power imports. Analysts have noted a significant omission in the U.S. list of demands: the automotive sector. Despite being the largest component of bilateral trade, the integrated auto supply chain was not mentioned in Greer's conditions. General Motors President Mark Ruiz and other industry leaders have testified to Congress that the complexity of these cross-border networks means that a single component often crosses the border multiple times during production. The absence of the auto sector from the ultimatum is viewed by many as an admission of its critical importance to the American economy. While Washington exerts pressure on dairy and digital services, the silence on automobiles suggests that the U.S. cannot risk a disruption to a manufacturing network that sustains hundreds of thousands of jobs in the American Midwest and Ontario. The long-term consequences of this diplomatic deadlock present several divergent paths for the North American economy. If the CUSMA framework were to collapse, the immediate impact would be felt in the automotive and agricultural sectors. Economic assessments suggest that a full disruption of integrated auto manufacturing could jeopardize over 150,000 Canadian jobs within 2 years, as manufacturers seek to reroute supply chains to avoid tariff exposure. For agricultural producers, particularly those in the prairies, the loss of preferential market access would necessitate a rapid shift toward alternative markets. While recent arrangements with China have provided some relief for canola and agricultural exports, replacing the volume and pricing reliability of the American market remains a multi-year infrastructure challenge rather than an immediate solution. Beyond the threat of total collapse, the potential for a scenario where CUSMA continues under Washington's terms carries its own set of structural risks. Experts indicate that dismantling dairy supply management would expose approximately 10,000 Canadian farming operations to a surplus of subsidized American products, potentially destabilizing rural economies in Quebec and Ontario. Furthermore, the removal of digital media protections would likely lead to a significant reduction in domestic investment for Canadian creative industries and independent media. Mark Carney's strategic refusal of the U.S. demands appears to be based on the calculation that the cost of such concessions exceeds the risks of a confrontation, provided that Canada can successfully diversify its trade dependencies. In response to the tension, Ottawa has accelerated its trade diversification initiatives, focusing on deepening partnerships with the European Union and expanding Indo-Pacific trade frameworks. Recent efforts include fast-tracking critical mineral agreements with Japan and South Korea, aimed at reducing the singular reliance on U.S. market access. This strategy was tested when Washington signaled it might invoke Article 32.10, the China Clause, following Carney's announcement of targeted trade arrangements with Beijing. Canadian officials successfully neutralized this threat by providing documentation that the arrangements did not constitute a formal free trade agreement, thereby demonstrating a high level of legal and strategic preparation prior to engaging with non-market economies. As the July 2026 decision point nears, the outcome remains dependent on whether internal U.S. industrial pressure will force a compromise, or if the relationship will shift toward a model of permanent uncertainty through rolling annual reviews. While American business coalitions have publicly urged the preservation of CUSMA to protect their own production networks, the geopolitical landscape is shifting toward a more fragmented trade environment. For Canada, the current standoff serves as a catalyst for a structural reset, moving away from being a single-pillar trade partner toward a more diversified global player. If you found this analysis insightful, please subscribe and turn on notifications for more updates on this developing story.